a pragmatic view about BIM from a chartered surveyor who really wanted to be an architect but unfortunately just didn't have the right skill set. So I probably look at BIM a little bit differently. What being a chartered surveyor has given me though is the ability to argue that really in the scheme of things the price of shoes doesn't cost very much. So that's very positive. But my take on BIM itself, I'm going to cover throughout the presentation client roles and responsibilities, processes to optimise the benefits of BIM. It's about being realistic about what you can achieve, creating and maintaining usable data, intellectual property and data ownership, and basic security considerations. I'll try and deal with things in that order, but it might get a little bit mixed up, but hopefully that won't be of any detriment. So, can we remember design and construction pre-BIM? Well, of course we can, because a lot of us are still actually working in that sort of environment. But we built buildings based on information, and that would take lots of different formats, and I've just listed some formats there. So a brief, drawing, specifications, and so on. And all of that would be contained in some form of contract and appointment. Projects with BIM are not that much dissimilar. But we've got two extra things. We've got models and we've got data. So we've got this environment that has potentially become more complex, and I'll put that question to you shortly. When we talk about models, we need to be clear about really what we're covering, and actually when you look in the BIM guidance there are a number of definitions of models, so we don't necessarily start off from clear guidance itself. We've got the protocol that says it's a digital representation of part of the physical and or functional characteristics of the project. Because it's digital, that could mean a variety of things. It doesn't necessarily mean it's a design model, it could be a cost model or a program, anything that is basically digital. When we look in the primary document that tells us about BIM for capital delivery, we know that the process of building information modelling looks at designing, constructing or operating using electronic object-oriented information. So my take on a model is that it is something that's digital and it's based on objects. Now those models, they create a virtual environment, they give us visualization and they're brilliant for communication, and they give us the ability to test. So we're able to see, well, what happens if we move this room? What happens if we relocate the door? What happens if we change the colours of this, that and the other? And that virtual environment is incredibly powerful, and it can be quite difficult to communicate to people that are not in the construction industry what a building is going to look like. And I'm sure when you've gone onto site, you've probably spent some time looking at concept drawings, and it clicks when you go onto site and you can see things coming together. Unfortunately, that process is quite risky, so we need to deal with that risk and use the visualizations helpfully. But models, because they're digital and they're object-oriented, they have data sitting behind them, and that data is incredibly powerful. It gives us, like the visualization, the ability to test, but to test in very different data-based ways. That then gives us the ability to analyse and to model further. So to go on and develop the cost models, the acoustic models, and so on. And in turn, that data gives us the ability to manage. So we start looking beyond design and construction and we start to look into operation. And if we think about the balance of costs between construction and operation, that's where the saving is to be made. So the data really is the power behind the models. So we have to think about two questions when we're looking at supporting projects with modelling. Firstly, how do we manage the models themselves? And secondly, how do we manage the data? And I will put the argument to you that I mentioned a couple of seconds ago, that really design modelling and or data availability actually introduces complexity into an already complex and unpredictable environment. We know it's complex and unpredictable because we have years of statistics saying that actually it's more likely that we'll finish a project late than we will on time, or it's more likely we'll finish a project in excess of the agreed budget than to it. So we know that what we've actually got is quite a risky environment. So we do need to look at how we manage that data and the modelling itself. So we need to have some form of rules. Why specifically? When we think about projects, they're complex things. There's not going to be, or very unlikely to be, a single model supporting that project. So we've firstly got to deal with multiple models. How do we get them to interface with one another? We need to think about multiple model originators, either within the same firm or in other practices, making sure that what somebody produces will work with what somebody else produces. And then also degrees of accuracy and detail. So we need to understand how confident we can be in what we can see through the visualization and the data itself. Intellectual property is an interesting one that I'm going to touch on later, but that also needs consideration. How we're going to deal with other information. I think the third slide along said actually we've got models, data, drawings, schedules, cost plans and so on. So we've got to think about all of that stuff. And then how we actually use the models for communication and visualization. Then we need to think about the data. We need to support decision making. We need to be able to make sure the data flows throughout the project team. We need to get the most out of it for analysis and manipulation. How do we share the data? How do we share the files? How do we do it in a very secure way? And how do we then take that data and push it into operation so that we can effectively maintain and operate the completed assets? So rules, what's not to be the whole point of the presentation is being pragmatic. There needs to be some form of shared understanding about what is needed in the first place. So on that basis, clients really need to take control. We're very good at writing briefs around construction and around what we expect to see, but we're not very good at writing briefs about what we want to do with data and information. I don't think a client would dream of asking for a project team to go and deliver a school without giving any more information than that. So we need to take the same quite detailed approach to making sure that we've got the data and information correct. Now we've got guidance that helps clients particularly to understand what their obligations are, and they're covered mainly in these three documents. So we've got the PAS for capital construction on with the green, we've got the BIM protocol, and then we've got the security-minded specification as well. Those documents set out what the client's obligations are, and it's very clear in those documents that clients do need to communicate the employee's information requirements for the data and the models. The protocol says that if you're a central government public sector project and you are implementing the project, the protocol, there must be an information manager in place, and it's a client's obligation to make sure that information manager is in place throughout the project. Doesn't need to be the same party or the same organisation, but the role has to be fulfilled. When we start to look at security-minded modelling, it's the client's responsibility to make sure that the right risk strategies and requirements are identified at the outset of the project. So actually the client, I think what's tended to happen over the last few years is that there has been a communication that there's been a requirement for level 2 BIM, but in some instances it's not gone beyond that, and then it's down to the project delivery team to work out exactly what's required. What this says is actually that's not really robust enough, and there needs to be very explicit requirements around the data and the modelling. So the rules are basically the production of the employer's information requirements, the BIM execution plan in response to that document, and then the protocol holding it all together. And when we look at clients' responsibilities, they need to produce the EIRs and they need to produce the protocol. And that protocol should sit within the supply chain, within everybody's appointment where they are using or generating models and data. So let's be realistic. The government set targets, which you'll be familiar with, around reducing cost, around reducing carbon, around speeding up delivery, and around lower emissions and greater use of the goods that we produce at home. And whether those figures are accurate or not, the aspiration is very clear that we have to become much more efficient. So that idea of putting in place the processes in itself will not be enough to get the most out of level 2 BIM. You can have all the processes you like, but unless people engage with them, they'll not necessarily be effective. So in addition to the processes, the rules, we need to have the people enthusiastic and optimistic about what's possible. And we need the right tools to get the most out of the data. Now, depending on who you are, that may just be the use of an Excel spreadsheet, or if you're producing designs, then it may be the requirement for very specific software. So there are a range of tools that are available to us, and together they will enable us to manage the risk that I talked about. I think perfection is unlikely in my optimistic take, and impossible when I'm feeling pessimistic. So will we achieve a 33% reduction in cost? I don't know, but can we achieve a reduction in cost? It's quite possible. So being realistic, being pragmatic is really important. Look to what you can achieve in a move towards government targets. Let's be realistic about data generation and application, because this is a really interesting one. Data will flow throughout a project team, and this is the whole concept really, that in the days pre-BIM we had lots of data and information, but it was sitting in different pockets and it was reproduced at every opportunity, and as a quantity surveyor I'm very, very guilty of doing that. The idea with level 2 BIM is that we have data originators, and mostly that will come out of design, and the data will flow throughout the team. And a key output of level 2 BIM is an asset database. So we go throughout our project and we work towards delivering and developing this asset database. The flow of data means that you have less intervention with it. You've still got the potential for intervention, but the less intervention you have, the less likely you are to reduce the risk around that intervention. So we need to think about how we ultimately work up the asset database. And the requirement for a COBie file is a key output of level 2 BIM, and really direction needs to be given from the client on what the expectation is to go into that asset database. If the project team is only told that they need to produce it, the likelihood is there'll be a massive volume of data produced that is neither not really usable in any sensible format. So we've got to think about what data we need, and we need to think about where it's going to come from. If all data sits in design, it's relatively easy to get it out, but we know that that's not going to be the case. Have we got any architects amongst us? Okay. Would you be comfortable putting in cost data against your objects and manufacturer's data when it's actually a subcontractor that's selected that object?
It comes down to the contract type, I think, if you're specifying manufacturer and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
I mean, traditionally in the past year I have specified manufacturer, so I would be
you'd be comfortable with it. But I think there'd probably become a point when you said, actually, that's too much for me to be providing. Am I able to give information about spares, about resources, about how much this is going to cost? There's a point at which data is not provided through models, but it comes from other directions. And it's really, that's the complex thing about generating asset database. When you've got data coming from all different directions, how do you get it into a usable format? So I like to have a picture of Albert Einstein, and I think, well, what would Albert say? And I think Albert would say, you need to think about what data you're going to use for operation and maintenance. The whole purpose of the asset database is, what are you going to use? Don't just have data for data's sake. And then you need to think, well, realistically, how am I going to maintain that data? And how am I going to access it? Then you can start to think about, well, who is going to provide it in the first place? And when you know who's going to provide it, you can start to think about, well, how is it going to be gathered? And if it's going to be gathered in an external system, you need to give thought to how it's going to be migrated into your operating systems. So there is a lot of consideration that needs to go around that requirement of the asset database. So being pragmatic, there's likely to be a need for a database, but make it one that is usable. Make the data both accessible and usable to you. Questions around data and information ownership and ability to use data and information. Does it change through level 2 BIM? Data and information ownership doesn't change through level 2 BIM. The situation has always been that data ownership resides with the originator. But what we do through projects and through contracts is that we license that use on to other people. Now it becomes a little bit more tricky in a modelling environment because we're actually handing over original files of data and information to other organisations, and we need to be clear about what's going to happen with those data and the files. The protocol does say that the data and information is used for the design, construction and operation and maintenance of the particular asset that you're concentrating on, but nothing beyond that. So the whole idea of ownership becomes topical because it's easy for it to be the data to be accessed and for it to be manipulated. In the world of drawings, it's less easy because there's some effort to go into reproducing what's on a drawing. So does the ability to use the data and information change? And yes, it does, because you start to work with the databases and you start to get the ability to interface software to produce different types of models and different types of activities. So that's quite an important one, and you may find that clients you're working with, or you may find if you are a client, that actually the ownership of that data is really important. And the thing to do is address it, not to just ignore it. Thinking about security. A fundamental principle of level 2 BIM is a single place to store files and data. And that's absolutely brilliant for collaboration, and we know that one of the key drivers for a level 2 BIM is to make the industry and the professions and organisations within it work better with one another. But that's an absolute nightmare for security. If you have everything all in one place, it means that you start to aggregate data and information. So a model in itself might not be very significant or might not give very much away. When you start to read that with briefing documents or with information that's been detached but is held in the same place, it can make then it can become very sensitive. So being pragmatic, acknowledge that there is a security risk. It's interesting that the cyber threats are around us all the time, and actually I'm not aware that you can do anything to completely deal with cyber risks. The guys that attack computers and systems will always be looking at how to improve their access into data and systems. But the thing is to acknowledge that security needs addressing and do what you possibly can to make sure it is addressed. So when you're looking at holding data and information all in one place, think about where that data and information is actually going to reside, because it is most likely to be in some data centre somewhere that's remote from the organisation that's actually providing you with the environment facility. Think about how access is going to be managed. It's interesting because when you give people access to everything, often they're not interested in it. It's when they've not got access to anything, when there's a curiosity that develops. So think about how you manage that access in a way that's going to be meaningful, and think about what permissions people have got to the data. The idea of common data environments is that really that they're client provided, but the reality is that they've tended to be contractor provided. So that means you've got a migration situation at some point throughout the project. So again, think about how that data is going to be provided on migration, and encryption, backup and disposal. They're just basic considerations for any client that need to be at least addressed. When we start to look at PAS 1192 Part 5, that goes into a lot of detail and does put the responsibility for identifying the security strategy onto the client. So final thoughts, just to wrap up. What would Einstein say again? Well, he did say quite some time ago, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. And I think that what level 2 BIM is it does introduce that quite significant cultural change into the business. I think we have been guilty. I've been in the industry now for 25 years, and nobody ever sets out with the idea of not delivering a project but we always do it in the same way, and therefore we do end up with the problems and the risks that mean that we don't have the predictability in the delivery around costs. So I think let's look at level 2 BIM as a way to address that risk and as a way to improve the industry. And going back to the first point, an early point about being pragmatic, there's never going to be a perfect project presenting itself for level 2 BIM. So it's important to take the next project and see what you can do. Even if it's the window replacement at the local school, think about how the data and information can be managed better. Doesn't mean that you have to model it. It means that you have to deal with data and information in a more joined up way and in a more transparent way. And that's it. Thank you very much. Are there any questions?
I'll say one quickly then.
Yeah.
Earlier on in the slide, you said about how BIM is adding an extra layer of complexity into an already complex and unpredictable sort of situation, if you like. My understanding is the whole concept of BIM and laying everything on the table, if you like, is you reduce the unpredictability because you're given all the information to inform and make decisions. So you might say complexity, but actually it's probably information which is useful and should be provided in the first case, which usually comes too late in the project and it causes the problem as an extra cost.
Yeah.
Later on down the line.
So the complexity bit is that models don't replace everything that's gone before. So we've still got models, we've still got schedules, we've still got briefs and so on. We've still got a lot of sources of data to deal with. And I think that the complexity is increased when we don't have any process around that. So just because we're modelling, it doesn't mean that we're going to model in a more timely fashion. It doesn't mean that the data that comes out of the models is going to be any better than data or information that would come out of drawings. I think you're right. What we need to do is to deal with the complexity, is to get transparency around what the models and the data and information is going to be used for. So what the creation of an information exchange program to address key decision points is really important, so that as a receiver of that information exchange program, as a member of the project team, you understand what decisions are being made when, and then that enables you to work out, well, what information is needed to provide those, to meet those decisions. And the information exchange program can be backed up by plain language questions to give context to that decision. And I think that is quite a significant change brought about by level 2 BIM, because we do have formal decision points in projects, but they're only formal because they are contract exchanges and contract completions. And what we do through level 2 BIM is we introduce more formal exchanges, meaning that decisions are made earlier and in mind of the right level of information to enable that decision to be made. So complex because we've got models and data in as well as everything else, but ultimately more transparent if the processes and the leadership from the client is more robust.
Right, I'll pitch one last thing then.
Yeah.
Again, the list of deliverables, your drawing specifications, schedules and all that sort of thing, and then you made reference to the BIM model and data, if you like. Again, they're not mutually exclusive, because I see the things on your left-hand column really as being outputs from the BIM model and data rather than something that's feeding into it or an addition. Yeah. So the idea is you're reducing the complexity of those items on the left because they're then coordinated in some way because the data's coming from the same source. Yes. Rather than duplicating.
Yes, absolutely agree. So what I was trying to demonstrate with that slide was that the models, the objects have inherent data within them, and it's the data that you're going to take out of models with interfacing software or whatever to allow you then to produce things like detailed programs and simulations and cost plans. So you are, although you've got models in addition to other things, you're reliant more on the model data. You know that if something's changed in the model, providing you access the latest one, that you'll pick up that data change, and then you start to get the dynamic links between what's been created in design and what's going to feed into other activities like cost planning or thermal analysis or a program simulation. So I didn't mean to identify that was a separate thing. It's something that's inherent. I was just trying to pull it out. Is that helpful? Any other questions?
I was going to ask about the level of information that you're getting from clients, the level of steer that you're getting at the moment from clients with regards to ARs and other things. To what extent are clients in fact driving that, and what's our role, do you think?
Well, we've been on the receiving end of briefs for BIM, and we've also been on the advising end to clients. So we're still, I think it's fair to say that we're still seeing invitations to tender that identify that there's a requirement for level 2 BIM, but don't actually go very much beyond that. And I think as professionals and contractors, we have a responsibility to identify that there's that either you need more information or you propose what you're going to do. I think the absolute worst thing is to stay silent. So I think we do have a responsibility to identify if the information is incomplete. I think where we are advising clients, and we've been doing it now for probably the last 3 years, in that time the guidance has become more complete, but I would say that the guidance is not fully complete, so there's still interpretation around it. And the things like production of model, production and delivery tables, which are the things that are covered by the protocol, so are really important. I think you do need to have a look at the reality of how those have been presented to us in protocols, and actually what do they mean. Just because we're told something in a guide, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's full and complete. So I think we have to question that and really think, although this is guidance, how will this work for my project? So where we've got where we're on the receiving end, take responsibility, go back to the client, ask for the clarifications. If there are none, put a proposal to them, I think. But where clients are producing briefs, have a look at our information requirements, have a look at them, see if they'll work, and see if you have to put clarity against them. And produce your BIM execution plans. If you've not got guidance on BIM execution plans, on the structure of them, produce them so that they do sort of speak back to the EIRs, so that it's easy to marry one to the other instead of just giving a standard template document that you've maybe developed.